Welcome to Roots of Representation, a podcast series brought to you by Knology, a leading organization creating practical social science for a better world. The podcast series is a part of our larger National Science Foundation-funded project called Black Rep for Kids, where we delve into the power of storytelling in helping young Black children prepare for and tackle the challenges of climate change. If you're interested in learning about how we can build a brighter climate future for Black children, their families, and their communities, you've come to the right place. Let's get started with Roots of Representation, the podcast centering Black climate story worlds for young minds. Welcome to Roots of Representation, Black-centered climate story worlds for young minds. Our guest for this episode is Dr. Fashina Aladé. Dr. Aladé brings expertise and scholarship in media studies, developmental psychology, and early childhood education. She's an assistant professor in the College of Communication Arts and Sciences and adjunct faculty in the Department of Human Development and Family Studies at Michigan State University. Her work focuses on using child-centered approaches to investigate children's understanding of racial diversity cues in STEM-focused educational television. Dr. Aladé's research is geared toward providing tangible insights for families and educators and has resulted in her numerous publications. And I'm really excited about the one, Who's Modeling STEM for Kids? A character analysis of children's STEM-focused television in the United States. And I'm so glad that I had a chance to look at that article. So Dr. Aladé, welcome to Roots of Representation.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, Ed. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Me too. And we're happy to have you here for this conversation. There's so much that we could explore. We're going to have to hold ourselves back today, but we've invited you to share some insights and suggestions through this lens of media studies and research. And we're going to look at the impact of climate media on young Black children and families, just to sort of play with some ideas that we can begin to think about with respect to the importance of face-to-face interactions with young children and how that differs from screen-based and other sources of print or digital media. And of course, we like to also make sure that we talk about how we can identify age-appropriate media for kids, just to look at that range that we're dealing with. But before we get to all of that, I'm going to ask you if you just tell us a bit about your work, how you came to it, what inspires you, and sort of how it intersects with this discussion around climate change. Just sort of give us some background.
Sure. Well, I hope this isn't going like way too far back, but when I think of like how I got to where I am today, there were sort of like two pivotal moments for me. Actually, like in my undergraduate career, that really like put me on this trajectory. And the first one maybe just mentioned very briefly, and then the other one is definitely relevant. So I'm going to get there. But so that I started at college. I was a communication major, but thinking I was going to do like broadcast journalism, something like that. Turns out I didn't much care for journalism, but I was really interested in like media effects research, right? And was in all these classes where we were learning about the impact of media on society, on humans, and and sort of the psychology of that, which I was fascinated by. And in those intro level classes, there's often the opportunity to like sign up for extra credit by participating in research. So I just signed up for some random study that fit my schedule, but turned out that was at the time, a children and media lab that was at Penn. We were down in the basement and they hooked me up to some eye tracking devices. And they were actually looking at a literacy show for preschoolers, Martha Speaks, which was a big one in that time that had text on the screen. And so they were looking at how adults' eyes moved on the screen in that literacy show compared to how young kids' eyes. So all that to say, I walked out of there being like, whoa, I didn't know that was an area of research, an career area that I could really look at. And so from that point on, I sort of like took every possible children and media class I could and signed up to be a research assistant in that area. But my other and maybe more relevant moment really was in one of those children and media classes. we watched this documentary called The World According to Sesame Street. And I just was totally moved. The documentary goes into, not just the history of Sesame Street in the US and how it was helping, really meant to help kids see that sort of urban environment and helping with math and literacy, all of that stuff. But then it also goes into all these co-productions that Sesame does all over the world and how they were helping kids deal with these big issues, right? Dealing with civil war in Kosovo, dealing with HIV in South Africa, dealing with these like big adult problems and approaching them in a way that was really helping kids sort of through these traumatic situations. And I was like, that's what I want to do. I want to be a part of this idea of helping kids through these big things that happen in our world and helping them live, grow and be happy and have their educational experiences and but also some of those like basic needs of learning washing hands, and it's okay to hug your friend who has HIV, these sorts of like big issues. So definitely related to, I know that was a little bit of a segue, but climate change being one of today's like big issues, and thinking about how media can help kids deal with this sort of major crisis we have, is really exciting for me.
Wow. I'm really exhilarated by the conversation thus far because you're pulling together all the different kinds of things that we really need to think about in our work. Whether we're creating a story world that's, fun and engaging, or whether we're bringing those other issues to the table. There are ways that we can do that relate to what we know about children, but also what we know about bringing those things to light. Um, what have been some of the common challenges you've seen or heard about in terms of Black children and families confronting with regard to climate change? Because that's one of the issues, of course, we're looking at, but it's tied to that bigger
Yeah.
set of ideas you were talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I have to be honest that I'm new to the climate change space, right? And so I'm learning here as we go. So I'm honestly not super familiar with what those kind of particular challenges are. I mean, I'm familiar with I think I am guilty of being one of those people that feels overwhelmed when we start talking about climate change. And it feels like, I don't know. I don't know how we tackle this. And I'm getting my feet wet here and learning. But I certainly understand that, it's exacerbating disparities that we already have, right? There are so many, um, you know, economic, educational, et cetera, disparities that Black families are facing, and climate change. At least that's my understanding so far. Is it's just making all those things worse.
No.
That's my very basic understanding right now.
Yeah, I think that's how a lot of us feel, and as an early childhood generalist who's involved in media and young children, I'm excited about that whole process too of learning more key information that's related to the climate change issues. But when we think about how media makers and educators, come to ways of approaching this, and you had mentioned some of the international co-productions of Sesame Workshop, like in Kosovo, where there were big war issues, or in South Africa, where there were issues around HIV and AIDS. What are some what are some things that come to mind that you think are important for story world creators to even think about if we're looking at bringing some of this information into early learning spaces and, spaces for children, let's say between the ages of 4 and 8, preschool, elementary kind
Hmm.
of grades? What kinds of things are important for us to keep in mind as principals, maybe?
Yeah, great. I love that question. You know, relating back to like my own feelings of overwhelm, I think that's the danger is that we think this is too scary. We don't want to talk to kids about it, right? And certainly that is not the case, right? There's a lot of great work. Fred Rogers was one of those well-known people for saying, kids can handle big topics. We just have to talk about it with them in supportive ways. And so I think that's one of the really big pieces, like first steps, just to sort of getting everyone on board with like, yeah, we should be talking to young kids about this, even though we may feel really scared and overwhelmed by it. I think that's like, I don't know, yeah, step one
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. And in terms of how we see ourselves in this conversation, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, and I think is related to some of the work that you're engaged in, is how we perceive ourselves as being part of conversations in terms of how we're represented in those conversations, whether,
Mm.
we see others who look like us having the conversation, or we see people on a page, or we hear about people who are problem solvers who look like us. What are some of the things that we could be talking about in ways that do that kind of representation, and is that
Mm.
important?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is this level of, and when we talk about sort of science in general, right? There's a there's some great work, sort of like draw scientist research, right? That shows decades and decades of what do children's drawings look like when you ask them to draw a scientist, right? And there was a study that came out in 2018 that looked at it over 50 years, and you know, overwhelmingly, decade after decade, for the most part, when you ask kids to draw a scientist, they are drawing a white male in a lab coat, right? And those that's gotten a little bit better in the more recent decades, right? It's not quite as staggering as it was 50 years ago, but still, sort of the recent work is still showing that that's overwhelmingly, that is still what kids are drawing. Um, and so, just this idea of, right, we all need to feel like we have agency in this problem, and that certainly can and should start young, right? And drawing that even closer to climate change, I think when we see climate change talked about, represented in sort of public media, popular media, the folks that are getting the publicity as sort of doing that work, right, are still often not looking like, not representative of Black
Mhm.
families, right? And so I think there's so many layers going on here, um, that are sort of making Black families especially feel removed from, uh, from the situation, from the solutions, right? That they're sort of not seeing themselves as part of the solution, and maybe not even feeling like they're getting any attention as being impacted by these problems, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that's another important piece of the larger question of what are the roots of representation
Mm.
that build a foundation for seeing ourselves with that agency that you talked about. And I think the other piece too is, so when we think about face-to-face interactions, or we talk about how we get children to tell us what they know, you were describing the drawing study, and how that, I think that those are kinds of things that we can pay more attention to, because they do help to shape a child's development. And I've mentioned in a couple of other interviews that I've been hearing this comment about, if you can see it, you can be it. And so
Mm.
there's even the notion of climate solutions or scientific solutions. If I
Mhm.
see that there's something that I can do or something I can be to make my contribution, that can be a big part of it. And so I'd like to jump just really quickly into some of the work that you've been involved in, which I think everything is grounded in story, you know,
Mm.
and
Mhm.
eventually that
Mhm.
story might be presented in the form of an animation or live action,
Sure.
but it might start with a book, or it might start with an oral story.
Mhm.
So when you were talking about STEM focused, television, in terms of how a character is seen, or how one sees oneself in the characters in a show. You talked about some of the things in Who's Modeling STEM for Kids that I thought were important. How does this apply to other story world mediums, whether it's storybooks or audiobooks or picture books? Some
Sure.
of the things you've been doing, because I think they're interrelated.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and absolutely, I agree with you 100%, right? Everything starts with a story, and we know that what makes for engaging high quality media is that it has a great engaging story and it has characters that kids connect with and really form relationships with. And so that is true right across medium, whether that's, from book to screen to iPad sort of tablet situation, right? Um, yeah. And so what we were seeing, a lot of my research is done with television, mostly because it is this, you know, wide reaching platform, right? So I think not because I think television is more important than any other medium, but because it does have this potential to reach audiences at mass. And so what we were looking at there, and that study actually came to me. I had been doing some work as part of a research team, it was National Science Foundation project about kids learning STEM. And so we were looking at sort of the processes of learning. What do they learn better from an interactive tablet versus from a more traditional, television screen? And so, and that work was great, but I really was left thinking like, okay, we know they can learn, but who are they learning it from is the question that really motivated that study. Right. And because we know characters are so important, there's actually like more and more research coming out that shows the characters are this like important in science world what we call a mediator, but the mechanism through which media effects happen, right? So often, whether it's talking about positive things like learning or negative things like aggression or any of these things that we all, and especially kids, do learn from media, it has a stronger impact when we really are connecting with the characters that we're watching or reading about or engaging with. And so, right. So given that, I was like, yeah, I really want to look at this, right? Who's doing this work of showing kids what STEM engagement looks like, what it looks like to, be interested, to have that sort of curiosity and scientific observation and asking questions. So that is what motivated that study. And, a lot of what we saw there was that there was so much use of non-human characters, ranging from animals to monster trucks and robots and everything in between, which is very common in kids animation, and not that it's necessarily a problem, but that it's sort of maybe a missed opportunity, right, for kids to actually see people looking like who they are. In addition to non-human characters, right, we were also seeing sort of the I was a little shocked by what a majority this was, right? But these of the human characters, so many were in this sort of racially ambiguous or even non-human characters. So the purple and the orange and the pink people, right? And the or the sort of medium brown colored people that animated characters who maybe they're a non-white character, right? Who knows? Could be. And so again, and I think that's a strategy, both sort of the animal and non-human characters, as well as those sort of ambiguously racialized characters that, are strategies that media producers are using. It's hard to say, is that like to skirt around the race issue, right? Or maybe with the best of intentions that we want most kids as possible to be able to identify with these characters. And so that's really the work that I'm doing now, is really trying to look more at what are kids taking away from these purple, pink, and green characters, right? As adults, we may see that and say like, okay, yeah, I could see how those are meant to represent different races or ethnicities, but are we expecting 4-year-olds to put that together? My expert opinion is like probably not, but we don't have a lot of research on that yet, and that's really sort of the space I've been playing in lately. I don't know if I totally answered your question. I want to come back to, you were asking about that connecting to books. And there's definitely some great research showing that as well in books. Just so many books for young kids use these animal characters, right? And we know that because those are often beloved and kids love, the fun talking animals. And again, it's not that that's necessarily a problem, but it's certainly I think this sort of missed opportunity for kids to really see characters who look like them, right, engaging in these things. So, yeah, hopefully I came around
No,
there.
no, I think that you covered a wide range of areas that I would like to see us even be able to go in more depth with, because when people come to the table and they want to author stories about things, and that's usually even if it starts with a script idea, it's, who are those characters, and what do they look like? um, that part oftentimes, doesn't get maybe as much attention, but it's important. And so I think what you're describing is, how do we reap the benefits of people to people relationships, and how can they be expanded, of course, by interacting with the rest of the world, and maybe even including some of those pink and green characters so that they can have their
Hmm. Hmm.
their role too. But um, I think with the early childhood climate education efforts, one of the things that I'm hearing you talk about also are the ways in which people see each other relating to each other. So when there are
Mm.
difficult conversations or there are issues that are questions, sometimes it's really easier maybe to not address it full on. But I think what you're
Hmm.
stating too is that it's important for people to see themselves engaged even in that kind of conversations. And so, is
Yeah.
there anything that maybe authors and illustrators and publishers can take advantage of um, in creating stories that do feature Black voices and characters? And I include voices because in a lot of the work that's done in film and television, they also try to listen to the oral side of how
Hmm.
people talk. Um,
Yes.
so, what are some ideas that you have about that notion?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so one of the things we know from research on young kids engaging with and learning from screens uh, is, I think, sometimes a little counterintuitive to media creators, because as adults we don't love to be hit over the head by messages, right? We tend to react, or you can call this reactance or counteract. We're like, well, that's, you stop trying to push your agenda on me or push this message on me. And so I think because that's as adults how we feel, we tend to, as you were sort of saying, tend to want to like massage these messages into the background of the stories, make them very subtle. But little kids actually don't experience that kind of reactance, right? And it turns out the more explicit the message, the more they learn, which sounds obvious, but really, I do think because it's sort of counter to the way that we engage with media, and so I think that's one of the things that I would absolutely say to your point there is just like, yes, tackling these conversations head on, being very direct and explicit, and modeling what the conversation can look like can be such a wonderful tool for young kids, especially.
Yeah, and I think too this notion of we talk a lot these days about social and emotional development and how it
Hmm.
plays a role. So, even if we're talking about something where there might be a disaster, we don't have to have the doom and gloom story just about the disaster, but we could have the conversation about care and concern, maybe for a
Yes.
neighbor that was
Yes.
impacted by a flood and what people did to support that neighbor. That might be a great story theme or idea. Or we could go to the animals and talk about, a puppy
Yeah.
that got,
Yeah.
sort of too hot and didn't have water outside. I mean, that's a difficult conversation to have, but in the context of a conversation with, a family member or, several different, scenarios like that, you can bring those kind of topics to the table. And so I
Mm.
I really appreciate the ways in which your work is sort of asking those questions of what is it the kids actually perceive, and do they even respond when they see somebody who looks like them? What are some of your speculations or ideas about that? Because I know there's some research you're doing, and you might not have any final results, but what do you speculate about that?
Yeah. So the thing with young kids, especially for most of my work is in that like preschool, 4 to 6, or sort of 8 as the top of the age range. They're so unpredictable when you try to talk to them about what did they like about characters, right? And so a lot of the work that I'm doing recently, when I'm in fact for example, showing them what I think many of us would think of as like good sort of counter stereotypical examples, and asking kids, yeah, what did you like about those characters? Are those characters like you at all? And to the adult eye, we might think like it's so clear that this kid looks like this character, and the kids are like, I don't know what you're talking about. This is that character is not like me at all, right? And it could be from something so you know, I am superficial as like, nope, they're wearing a different color shirt than me, so they're not like me at all, right? So there's actually we don't know a ton about what makes kids connect with characters. We know that they like the silly characters, they like the ones that make them laugh. That seems to be true across the board. Um, but so that's what I think the sort of the tricky point is knowing, and I firmly believe that there's long term impact in seeing characters who look like you on screen, but like figuring out how to measure that impact so that we can say to the funders and the producers, like, here, you do this because here's this
Mhm.
long-term impact that it has. Like, research hasn't caught up there yet, right? Like, I think we are uh, I really want to be doing this work that can like tangibly say, this representation, kids seeing themselves on screen has X, Y, and Z long-term positive outcomes, and we don't have that yet, and I'm trying to figure out how to get that
Well,
data.
but I think that this is important because when we think about how um, in depth conversations take place about the importance of being represented. What I'm hearing you say is that there are multiple ways in which representation can take place. One of which has to do with the developmental stage of a child and how he or she perceives the world. And interesting, fun, and engaging, funny kinds of things are needing to be represented along with how children look and
Yeah,
interact with each other and their peers who may be similar or different. So maybe it's not so much an either or approach to this notion of
right.
representation. What do you think about that? I mean, because you're giving us
Yeah,
some important information to think about as story creators, as individuals who are having this discussion about representation and how it should play a role in authoring children's stories. What other things might we begin to think about?
yeah. That's really making me think about how important it is to have these multi-dimensional characters, and that for decades Black characters on screen were just filling these tropes, right? That like we're often hitting these, one of four types of sort of stereotypical characters. And we're seeing recently more breaking down of that. But I think that really speaks to, yeah, the fact that there are so many sort of nuanced things that kids can connect with, I think speaks to the importance of having multi-dimensional nuanced characters, right? And so that they can both maybe see their race or ethnicity represented, um, but also I really like that character because he wears glasses like me, or I like that character because they have two dads or two moms like I do, right? Like getting at those different
Mhm.
elements of what could make a kid connect, right? Where they have three brothers and sisters, and I have three brothers and sisters, right? All of those, there's just this, and of course, no one story can do all of those
Mhm.
things. But I think as we're just as each one is sort of adding to what kids have in their sort of like reading and media diets, that like the more of a range of full multidimensional characters they have, I think the better they're off they're going to be.
Yeah, I like that as well, and I think that there was a book that I recently came across through Imagination Press, which is the press of the American Psychological Association, called "Something Happened to Our Planet." And what was attractive to me before I even opened the book was that it was providing sort of like a provocation. Something happened
Mm,
to our planet, and then it was like what kids do, in the midst of climate. and these little adventures take place, and the representation of those kids participating in that cut across, I think, different ways in which people looked and presented. But I think your point is well taken too, that there are multiple ways in which that engagement can take place, whether it's an interaction that is specific with maybe an intergenerational character, because also some
Mhm.
people have intergenerational families that they interact with that are
Absolutely.
important to them. So I think you're giving us some things to think about that help us to further explore what does it mean to increase and improve Black representation. And so there are multiple things that make us who we are. And there are multiple things that make cultures and ethnic groups who they are. And so I think we need to take advantage of that experience and how it can be told as a story. One of the
Yeah.
things that I wanted to ask you is that in conjunction with like other individuals or groups or resources that are out there, what kinds of things should we maybe pay attention to? I know that you identified something that was a publication which we can put in our resources that deals with authentically inclusive representation. That got me thinking a little bit. Tell me a little bit more about some other things you think we should probably look at to help our thinking about this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that work is out of the Center for Scholars and Storytellers, but I love and have adapted that terminology of authentically inclusive representation because right we've got to get past just diversity because I think what has happened is we've seen that how content creators have answered this call for diversity is often putting, well, okay, we'll just throw one of every different color in the cast and now we've done it, box checked, right? um, and so this idea of authentically inclusive representation, meaning like, you know, what is it about this character besides their skin color that is authentic and that, going back to the earlier point of multidimensional characters and right, that uh, getting beyond the sort of stereotypical tropes of, well, these characters do those activities and these characters do those
Mhm.
activities, right? And um, yeah, and so that report was really cool in that it showed, and that was not specifically with young kids, but mainstream movies actually, and they showed that when films were more authentically inclusive, they actually did better in the box office. And I loved seeing, that kind of. I feel like we need more of that, more to say like, yeah, it's not just don't just do it because it's right. We want you to do it because it's right? Like but also right? It's going to be helpful for the bottom line as well.
Well, I'm really happy that you identified that, and like I said, we can share that with our listeners in our resources. One of the other things is that um, you talk a little bit about some of the ways in which children's STEM TV can be used as a tool for what I call media literacy. And
Mm.
that's through organizations like Common Sense Media. What do you think they have to offer us as we're thinking about authoring stories or creating story worlds? Is there a role that a resource
Mm.
like that can play in helping us?
That's a great spin on how I typically think about common sense, right? So I usually think of them as mostly a resource for parents or educators who are looking for high quality content. And especially I find that parents today are so just overwhelmed by like how much content there is everywhere. And, so I often encourage them to go to Common Sense if they just want some like quick tips. There's great sort of editorial lists on, if you want stuff that shows positive female characters, here's a bunch of, these types of things. And you can sort by your kid's age group. But I love this question of like, what does that resource do for those who are maybe creating the stories? I think there's a really nice opportunity to use some of those sort of editorial lists as a way to say like what's missing, whose voice is missing, who's not shown. In preparing for this podcast, I checked out Common Sense's list of, I think it was films that films that can help kids learn about climate change or climate science. And it was really, really nice list. And certainly I'm not criticizing it, but just was with this conversation in mind, I was sort of scrolling through, and there's not a lot of representation on that list. I think I explicitly saw maybe one character, and this is just based off of the little thumbnail that they give. So of course, it could be more than what I saw, but I saw one character of color represented on that list. So I think that's a really, I love the idea of sort of flipping these resources to say, okay, here's what's out there. Here's what is probably the good content that exists, and like, what can I add? What can right? Who's missing from these stories, and whose voices are missing? And thinking about, if creators are trying to sort of find their space, that could be a way to use that resource.
And maybe we can also bring people to the conversation who are authors and storytellers of African descent who are trying to actually create, and we don't know much about them. So perhaps we can create our little list along with the work that we're doing with this project, and as we continue to do our community of practice work. I think that's what we're really trying to build here. So you've really provided us with some information and I think perspectives to help think about STEM-related knowledge, multiple ways of looking at children and who they are, and thinking about all of that in relationship to how we can begin to think about creating literature and hands-on experiences that are relevant and do represent those individuals who happen to be African American or from Black communities. So I want to thank you for taking this time with us today, and we're going to look forward to continuing the conversation with you as we continue to explore roots of representation, Black-centered climate story worlds for young minds. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me. And yes, I definitely look forward to continuing the conversation.
Perfect.
Thanks for listening to Roots of Representation. If you'd like to comment on this episode, please head over to blackrepforkids.knowledge.org. Our website also contains free resources and more information about the project, which is led by Knology in collaboration with the Highlights Foundation, the National Black Child Development Institute, the Association of Children's Museums, and a panel of nationally recognized advisors. Remember, Black Rep for Kids isn't just a podcast. It's an essential part of the project's culminating experience, which will be a 2-day unconference event held in fall 2024. Head over to the website to register now. And in the meantime, let's keep the conversation going. You can also share your ideas and resources for amplifying Black voices and stories in children's STEM literature at blackrepforkids.knowledge.org. Roots of Representation is produced by ABF Creative, an award-winning podcast network that creates cultural and emotional connections through podcasts. The series is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advancing Informal STEM Learning Program under grant number 2314101. Any opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this podcast series are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Science Foundation. Roots of Representation, the podcast centering Black climate story worlds for young minds.